Hello, Robert here. Voluntary fact check, helping if you're scared. And France is not going to send troops into Ukraine. There's absolutely no way. So that's the first thing that I want to explain to you. So I know that lots of people who are suggesting it will. But, well, first of all, France can't send troops into Ukraine unless Ukraine wants them. That's pretty obvious. Now, just try listening and thinking to what has Zelensky said. Has Zelensky ever said he wants troops in Ukraine from NATO? The answer is no, never. Zelensky has asked for air defense systems, he has asked for fighter jets, he has asked for ATACMS, he has asked for the German Taurus cruise missile, he has asked for the F-16 fighter jets and the tanks. I can't remember what else. I've maybe already mentioned some of them already. He's asked for all sorts of things like that. But he has never once asked for soldiers. And then people talk about how, but Ukraine is running short. It wants to recruit 400,000 more soldiers. Well, it can. Ukraine has actually, it's only using a small part of its fighting age soldiers. For instance, you're not even permitted to fight on the front line in Ukraine until you have passed the age where, well, you are permitted to, but you're not going to be conscripted until you've reached beyond college age, until you've reached the point where you would have your professional qualifications. And the reason that Ukraine is doing that is because it wants to ensure that it has qualified people for after the war is over. So that's quite unusual for an army. So its conscription is only for older people because it doesn't want the younger people to have to be forced into conscription yet until they're qualified with whatever they are, engineers or teachers or whatever it is that they're doing. Then they get their qualifications first, and then they're conscripted. And the reason that Ukraine wants to find a way to get 400,000 more soldiers into its army, it's got 1 million already, but they have been fighting since the war started. Some of them have been fighting since the very start of the war. And 3 years of fighting is a very long time for a soldier fighting at the front line, even with breaks. And so Zelensky and the generals are very keen for them to be able to leave service if they want to at 3 years. But they obviously, with 1 million soldiers who might decide depending on when they started, when they were conscripted, as we go through 2025, they will reach their 3 years endpoint. So that's what the 400,000 soldiers are for. It wants to have those soldiers. It takes 6 months at least to train soldiers for the front line. And it wants those soldiers to be ready for 2025. They're not needed right now. And Ukraine has loads and loads of people, of young men and older men, but within fighting age. I mean, not very young men, because for the reason I explained, that it can, and it doesn't conscript everyone above the professional age. It still has lots of people in civilian, in the civil, in the only running of the country. Its businesses are still running. Its electricity, its shops and things. Everything is still running. It's still got people doing those things. And so, Zelensky, Ukraine has lots of people who could be soldiers, and it has all the soldiers it wants and needs. It is not looking for more soldiers. And it is also very careful about foreign fighters. So in 2022 it accepted anyone who wanted to fight in Ukraine practically. But now it will only accept them if they have previous experience in a war zone actually fighting. It doesn't want people to join its army who haven't fought and faced death before in a war. So Ukraine is very picky about its soldiers and careful. And so it's not very credible at all that that there might be some secret deal going on between Ukraine and France. That's not going on either. That doesn't make sense. So France doesn't want the soldiers. And then Ukraine doesn't want the soldiers. Now, if you go and look at it from the NATO point of view, then Macron might very well, could very well think that if France sends its soldiers to Ukraine, that's going to be no problem. Poland certainly thought that. Poland wanted to send humanitarian missions to rescue the civilians in Mariupol before Ukraine took all of Mariupol in spring 2022. And it didn't think that there was a serious risk to Poland from doing that. The soldiers would just have defended themselves. There would be no risk to the Russian Federation. They knew that Putin was just bluffs about nukes. They knew that he wouldn't start firing at nukes at NATO just because some Polish soldiers are going to Mariupol to rescue civilians there. But they didn't do it because the reason is that other NATO countries were very nervous about that. And they just felt, well, Poland, please don't do that, because if you do that, then we worry that Russia might attack Germany or something. So that NATO countries work together, and they are not going to send soldiers to Ukraine if some of the countries worry that Russia will attack them in response. Even if the other ones are totally sure that Russia won't do that. But because they're part of NATO and they have to respect the beliefs of the other countries, they're not going to do it for political reasons. Legally they can do it. Politically, there's no way that France will send soldiers into Ukraine, no matter how confident it is that Russia is not going to attack Germany, say. But it's just not going to do it unless Olaf Scholz is completely happy with it. And same with all the other NATO countries. So this is just not going to happen. It's all just bluff. And it's the very first time really in the war we've had NATO bluff, Putin bluffing over and over and over again. And Macron has decided he's going to kind of bluff back to Putin and say, well, you don't know what's going to happen. We're not going to tell you whether we'll send soldiers to Ukraine or not. And that just gets Putin thinking a bit, and maybe a little bit rattled. I think that's at least part of what Macron is doing. And other reasons too, because of the coming up EU elections and so on. Now, I want to help you to filter out spin. So, a lot of the stories that are shared on the Doomsday Debunk group on Facebook are spin. And I immediately tell, when I look at them, I look at the headline, I look at the first paragraph, I usually can tell just from the headline, say, look, that's spin. So what I mean by spin, what I mean is that they are activists, they're trying to get you to do something. They're trying to persuade you to do something, or they're trying to persuade Russia to do something. Or they're trying to persuade someone to do something. And so they only present one side of the argument, they leave out everything else. When you see an article like that, you are not going to get an objective assessment of how the war is progressing. So here are some of the things to watch out for, and if they don't mention these things, it is spin. So if it's someone who says that Russia is going to quickly take over large areas of Ukraine, they don't mention that Europe is stepping up on making shells and buying shells to supply to Ukraine, then it's spin. They don't mention that Russia has issues with the finance for their own, they are financed by the oil industry, and that's what all the oil sanctions are about. The Russian defense. They can't use the Russian GDP, that is just the sum of all the businesses in Russia. You can't use that for the defense. You have to use something specific, and they use the oil industry. And they're having problems. They have to make sure that they can get the funding from the oil industry. And then there's the issue of making their shells, and they just don't have the defense industrial base to do it at present. And they've got 1 million shells from North Korea. They hope to increase to 1.3 million shells per year by the end of 2024. They've got the same problem as Ukraine has. They've got to fill in the gap before as they increase the shell capacity. So they have problems too on their side. So if they don't tell you to talk about those, again it's spin. Then if they don't tell you that Russia's most modern air defences are struggling, trying to stop NATO equipment that was first used in the 1980s. They don't tell you that. They don't tell you how superior, vastly superior NATO equipment is to the very best Russian equipment. Then again it's spin. And then if they tell you that Russia will suddenly take over much of Ukraine, but they don't tell you this. So the Institute of Study of War, in one of its articles, which was definitely spin, it gave the impression that Russia is going to take over much of Ukraine, and that the bill, and it said at the very end, this is why the House has to vote for the bill in the United States. So it's very clearly activist. That's why they did it. And they never mentioned, they gave the impression, in using vague language, that Russia is going to start charging through Ukraine, and that the United States has to find this money in order to stop this. But then, if you go and look at their detailed assessment, then they say that Russia can't cross the Oskil River to the main city of Kupiansk. And they say that the Ukraine has been very effective. It's put up its fortifications. It's going to protect most of the small the villages and very small cities or towns really on the other side of the river from Kupiansk, at the kind of the outskirts of Kupiansk. It's very unlikely that Russia is going to move, and that is far too small for you to even see at this scale. You can't even see Kupiansk at this scale. They're not likely to can't push beyond Avdiivka. At this scale you can't see Avdiivka, the tiny little pocket that Russia has been fighting on for so long. It's only 5 miles by 5 miles. Tiny little spot there that they have managed to take over the winter of 2023 to 2024. And they can't go any further. They can't push any further. Nobody even suggests that Russia can go and advance anywhere along there. And nobody even suggests that they can advance across the Dnieper River. So where are they supposed to be doing this massive charge? There's nowhere. It's just not true. So that's another example of spin. And if they say that Russia is going to go charging across Ukraine, and it's going to threaten Kiev, or it's going to threaten Kharkiv, which is over there, or it's going to threaten Dnipro, it's going to threaten Odessa, which is way over there, how are they going to get there when they can't even cross there? So some people do suggest that, and it's just not true. So the front line is very static, and it is actually the Russian side that is very weak, not the Ukrainian side, as I will explain in a minute. Russia should have been prioritizing its defenses all winter instead of doing these pointless advances, because it's in a very, very vulnerable situation coming into the fighting season. So yeah, I talk about those here. So there's a vulnerability there. Now the Russian minefields that they built over 2022 to 23, they are far wider than the width that the NATO equipment can cross. So NATO had supplied Ukraine with mine clearing equipment. What they didn't realize was that the cords they sent them and the various methods they used, they just weren't long enough to reach the far side of the very deep Russian minefields. And the various other issues as well. Ukraine tried this early on in spring 2023 and it just didn't work. They ended up in the middle of the minefield with the Russians dropping shells on them and dropping mines on them behind on the area they're supposed to have laid, and with loads and loads, lots and lots of the minefield to get through, and just no way of getting through it. And so the Ukrainians just said, this is not working. And so they stopped. And so they had to do it patiently by hand. So these soldiers, so these are removing anti-tank mines. Anti-tank mines aren't going to be set off by soldiers if they're careful. But they are mixed up with anti-personnel mines, which are set off by soldiers. And little platoons of soldiers had to weave their way through these minefields. They had to find and destroy all the anti-personnel mines, trigger them, and then they had to remove and demine the anti-tank mines, and do them by hand, because the automated equipment it wasn't fit for purpose. And they did thousands and thousands of these missions all through the summer of 2023. And that is how eventually Ukraine got across both of the front lines, both of the thick minefields. There's one more minefield left, but it's not so dense at all because Russia is constantly going back and forth through it. So that is a very vulnerable spot for Ukraine, for Russia, and Ukraine is too. It's got two footholds here. The minefields are washed away all along the Dnipro River because of the Novokakova flood. Then, because of the novel way that Ukraine is using the Patriot air defense system, which is far better than people had thought it would be, Russia can't even fly its command posts over the Azov Sea, which it needs in order it needs its fighter jets are not very independent. They need these air command posts in order to do their missions. And those air command posts can't fly close to the front line. They also often lose their fighter jets. And they're just not very modern equipment, so they're very dependent on these rather archaic mobile air command systems. And Ukraine has shot down two of them, and there are not very many of them left. And then Ukraine has continued to keep the entire Russian Black Sea fleet out of Crimea. It's way on the far side of the Baltic Sea. And the various other things, there's just loads of vulnerabilities here. So I talk about the counteroffensive at the end of this talk, but basically blog post. But basically, what Ukraine is likely to do when it does this counteroffensive. So yeah, important to realise, Ukraine did not lose a counteroffensive in 2023. It never got to the point of launching its counteroffensive, because the first thing it had to do was to go through the minefields before it could launch the counteroffensive. It got through the minefield at the end of the fighting season in 2023. It was all ready to do a counteroffensive, and people were talking about, well, maybe it's going to do it now. But that was when the bill got stuck in Congress in the United States. And I think there's a good chance that if that bill hadn't got stuck, they'd have done a counteroffensive in November. But they didn't. And instead, their priority of the United States was to make sure that they sent lots of defensive equipment to Ukraine. And then Ukraine transitioned using more and more help from Germany. And that's how it managed to get through the winter 2022 to 2023 to 24 by getting help from Germany and Europe hugely ramping up, and the tail end of the support from the United States, which was at that point was totally focused on defense. And they stopped sending Ukraine the things it needed for counteroffensives, because it was clear that this bill wasn't going to go through very easily, and it still hasn't gone through. And so that's why Ukraine didn't do its counteroffensive. So it hasn't had a failed counteroffensive. It's had a delayed one, where it clearly needs more equipment to do a counteroffensive. It may have enough now for small counteroffensives. So if the bill doesn't go through, then what may happen in 2023, they may do a small counteroffensive here, say. Now, these are just I'm just showing you the most obvious things that anyone can see just by looking at the map, and that people have debated endlessly on Twitter. Nothing secret, nothing that I had to hunt around and try to find somewhere obscure. So I'm not going to talk about things like that. So the only things that are very obvious is that one there, and then that one there, which is that they could go through that they across the Dnipro River, which is clearly intended for some kind of counteroffensive to find a high point on the far side of the Dnipro River from Kherson City, and so they could go across there and they could take that. They could go through there and they could threaten Tokmak, and then from there they would have artillery control of the road along the Azov Sea, and from here they would have just a good outpost to stop it would help protect Kherson City, and it would be a beginning of a way into, and it would be reasonably robust. They're next to the Oleshki Sands, which makes it quite with somewhere here, somewhere thereabouts. Leshkistan is a kind of small desert, which is very open and exposed for the Russians. So the Ukrainians can set up an outpost somewhere there, and they could have a kind of small counter-offensive, but still quite effective, set up a permanent outpost, set up the artillery, set up their air defences, set up their counter-artillery and their all howitzers and all their things in that area, and just make it a nice, and then put fortifications around it, and have an area there on the far side of the Dnieper River. So those are two things. They're kind of very obvious things they could do. But the Ukraine often does very unobvious things. So they probably have lots of secret plans that mightn't be as obvious as that. So, but there's lots of things that Ukraine can do. It's given itself loads and loads of possibilities there. That they look on that map, and they will have X, Y, Z. They will have 3, 4, 5, 6 different places they can probably do a counter-offensive, not just those two places. But those are the two most obvious ones. So, and this is about how the Ukraine's shell problems, they're now on the way to being completely solved. So, first of all, Europe has stepped up on its shell production. I've got a section here about it. There are 31 projects across 15 countries, mainly Germany, Norway, France, Italy, Greece, Czechia and Finland, that are all working together to provide shells for Ukraine. And they expect to bring the total shell production capacity to 1.4 to 1.7 millions a year by the end of 2024. And they expect to surpass 2 millions a year by early 2026, just based on what they're doing already. So that is Europe stepping up on its shell capacity. To put that in context, Ukraine needs about 2.4 million a year. So there's obviously it's got a little bit of a gap still. And then Ukraine is producing some of its own. It's got 7 billion a year, and some significant amount of that, but they are not disclosing how much is being used to make shells in Ukraine, because Ukraine has a very large industrial defense base of its own, and so Ukraine is doing that, and Ukraine is making its own shells, but it just won't tell anyone how many it's making. It's secret information. So, but it seems that there's still a bit of a shortfall in 2024, and so that is where Czechia has come in. So the specific types of shells that Ukraine needs for the NATO equipment, it's a very specific type of shell. These are made in NATO countries, they're also made in South Korea, in India and in Pakistan. And Czechia says it has found 1.5 million extra shells that it can source from those countries. Now, it hasn't said which countries they're from. South Korea would be the least controversial. India and Pakistan are sort of allies of, well, not quite allies, they wouldn't fight with Russia, but they're trying to maintain cordial terms with Russia, similar to China, what China is doing. They're not supplying Russia with military equipment, but they're trying to keep on good terms with it. So as one or other of those, it could be both of them, are secretly supplying shells to NATO countries. And Czechia has found 1.5 million shells altogether. And it has funding from NATO countries for 500,000 of those shells, including some of that funding is from France. And the total cost for all 1.5 million would be about 3.2 billion. So it's basically it's $2,000 per shell, just basic arithmetic from that. So that's what's going on there, and then Europe is making 1.4 million of its own. So it's got 1.5 million to add. Then Europe's already made 500,000 for Ukraine. Then it's got these 1.5 million from Czechia for 2024, and it's going to have 1.4 million a year by the end of 2024, up to 1.7. And then if Congress approves the funds, assuming it does, that US will be able to make 1.2 million by the end of pay 25, which would add to it. But if not, then the EU will just have to step up more. And so it's going to be far better, even without the US bill. But it's got this gap. And that's where Czechia has come in, and Czechia has found the missing shells. And that's why I've charted this section. It's on their way to being completely solved now, Ukraine's shell supply problems. And quite a lot of those shells, Czechia is already, some shells will reach Ukraine in a few weeks, of those shells that it's ordering. And remember, Ukraine is not without shells. And Ukraine it pretends to Russia, I think, to be far weaker than it really is. I think it's trying to make Russia overconfident or something. And trying to distract Russia away from, if it was to make itself seem strong, then Russia might focus more on defending itself. I think that might be part of it. And they're trying to get Russia to be more aggressive and fighting against it. And that may be part of what's going on. Anyway, for whatever reason, and there's loads and loads of funding. Adding all up, I found 26. If you leave out the US has got 4.2 billion in presidential drawdown authority that they haven't used yet. So this means they can withdraw 4.2 billion's worth of their cluster munitions or their ATACMS or stuff like that from their stockpiles to send to Ukraine without any more consent from Congress. So they got that in left. If they felt it was urgent enough, they could start using that. And then if you add up all the others, there's 22.3 billion of presidential. 22. And there, that's 0.3 million that Ukraine, that US has actually added as well, which is actually already sent to in the UAE capacity to Ukraine. So I left that out as well. So that's quite a lot. And then remember, Ukraine has 7 billion of its own to add to that as well. And so the EU as a whole, it's made multi-year commitment to sustain Ukrainian civil economy for the next few years, which is quite important. The EU as a whole doesn't want to supply Ukraine as a whole as a military thing. It wants to supply it on its peaceful. So the EU has got this peaceful thing of supplying Ukrainian civil society and government and everything, which is very important because that then frees up Ukraine so that it can do its military things, confident that it's got the civilian side of structures being supported. Like the infrastructure and stuff and supplies and things. I'm not quite sure what the details are, but humanitarian stuff and keeping this and basically keeping the economy going. Then the EU has committed to do that for multi-years to support Ukraine. And then individual EU countries have committed that 22.3 billion of purely military funding, and individual countries, Germany and UK, France, Scandinavian, Baltic states and Poland, they're all very committed to Ukraine, and several of those have done multi-year commitments already, especially Germany. And then now if we go and look at the shells, this little bit about how Russia needs shells far more than Ukraine does. So this you've surely seen the images of the cities that are shelled by Russia, and you don't see the same images like when Ukraine liberated Kherson. Nothing was destroyed there by Ukraine at all. And Ukraine is very careful not to destroy the infrastructure because it wants to maintain them in good shape, and wants to keep the homes for its citizens and so on. Whereas Russia, it doesn't seem to care less about maintaining the industry. It's very unclear why Russia is even invading Ukraine, because, for instance, the main prize in Mariupol was the Azov Steelworks, but there's no Azov Steelworks there anymore. The main prize in Avdiivka was the Avdiivka coke plant, which used to supply most of the coke to Chazov steelworks. That's just demolished. So Russia is destroying the best industry of Ukraine, which is what it was good for. Eastern Ukraine was noted for its industry. And Russia, in taking it, is destroying its industry. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would it, if it was trying to take Eastern Ukraine because it wanted to add to its own industrial base, then why is it destroying all the industry in Eastern Ukraine? Fertilizer plants and things, just all sorts of random things, just destroying it as it goes. And anyway, that is why Russia needs so many shells, because it destroys everything, and it takes a huge amount of shells to destroy a building like that. And so Russia needs many more shells than Ukraine does, and it uses many more, and it uses them as dumb shells. So when you saw that Russia can make 1.3 and Europe can make 1.4, remember Russia needs far more shells than Ukraine does. So it's not as if they've got equal amounts, then Russia isn't going to do very well, because the Ukrainian shells are far more precise, and it uses its shells on purely military targets, like command posts, like fuel dumps, like shell munition supplies, like bridges and like railway lines and so on, that are used to transport things around. That's what Ukraine uses its shells against, and individual tanks and things. Whereas Russia uses its shells against domestic buildings, and against hospitals sometimes, and theatres, and it uses a lot against industrial buildings. So it's, I mean, it would have been fighting the. It's quite possible that the Ukrainians were in that building, but Russia's just not bothered. It doesn't try to doesn't try to find skillful ways to kind of sneakily get the Ukrainians out. It just batters away until it goes through. So and now we're not going to get anything like Russia's rapid advance in spring 2022, because back then Ukraine didn't have any NATO equipment. So what we had was Ukraine with ancient Soviet equipment from the 1980s, and Russia with modern Russian equipment and ancient Soviet equipment, but also completely very modern Russian tanks and Russian fighter jets and things. And Ukraine had no chance, and it knew it. So it let Russia advance far too quickly, and then it cut off its supplies. And that's how it managed to win the Battle of Kiev. It got Russia to be overconfident. But Russia can't do that again. If Russia was to try attacking from Belarus, then Ukraine has far better equipment. They would just stop it dead, and it couldn't do it. So Russia can't do those rapid advances again. Okay, this is about how Ukraine, I already explained. Ukraine is not short of soldiers. That's just for when they retire. Did I explain that? That when excuse me if I've already said it, I'll just say it very briefly, that the Ukrainian soldiers, Ukraine has 1 million soldiers. No, I think I just did the practice video, sorry. So Ukraine is, its soldiers are much older than you normally expect, because Ukraine doesn't recruit soldiers. It doesn't conscript soldiers. You can volunteer as a young soldier, but if you want to do a profession, like you want to be an engineer or a teacher or something, then Ukraine will not conscript you until you finish your professional training. Or you want to be a doctor or a vet or something, you've got to complete your professional training before they'll even consider conscripting you. So that's why Ukraine has got a very late cut-off age. It won't recruit the very young soldiers, even though young soldiers are very fit and they're like athletes at the Olympics. They can rush around much faster, not significantly faster, but significantly faster. But they're a little bit more athletic. But that's not Ukraine's priority. So Ukraine says that we want our soldiers, we want our young people to be trained for their professional career as young people, and then only after that we'll conscript them. And then most of them they don't conscript. So Ukraine has 1 million soldiers, but it has many millions that it could conscript from in the requisite age range. So it's quite a large country, 40 million I think or something, and it's only 1 million in soldiers. It's really quite small given quite a long age range of, and all the men of a certain age until quite a long age range are eligible to fight, and a certain number are conscripted. So Ukraine is not short of soldiers. The reason it wants 40,000 soldiers is because the Ukrainian military and Zelensky, they think that 3 years is about as long as they should require a Ukrainian soldier to fight on the front line. So after 3 years, they want them to be able to retire from service if they want to. They can stay on if they want to, but they expect hundreds of thousands of them to want to leave service in 2025 when they reach 3 years. And they want to give them that option. They haven't yet said that they will be able to retire at 3 years, but they want to be able to say that. So for that reason, they have to start recruiting their replacements. And it takes 6 months to train a replacement soldier at least. So sometime in summer 2024, they're going to have to start recruiting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian to replace the ones that they expect to retire from service in 2025. So that's what that 400,000 soldiers is about. So Ukraine has plenty of soldiers. It's not running short of soldiers. And then this is why Ukraine is on the defensive in winter. I think I already explained that. So Ukraine, in winter, Russia advances. Its soldiers can only drive. Its tanks can only drive on the roads. And if they drive off the road, then they'll just sink into the mud. So that makes them very vulnerable in winter. And according to one very detailed open source intelligence source, they give links for every item. For the tanks, they have actual photographs of every tank destroyed. Then they've counted to 224 tanks lost by Russia, 21 tanks lost by Ukraine during the Battle of Avdiivka. So normally it would be 3, the attacker always loses more than the defender. But in this case, 10 to 1 is a huge ratio. It's normally 3 to 1. So every 10 tanks that Russia lost, Ukraine lost only 1. Same for the infantry armoured fighting vehicles. As for the anti-aircraft systems, Ukraine didn't lose any because they got very mobile anti-aircraft systems. So that is why Ukraine held on to Avdiivka, not because they cared about Avdiivka, but because they wanted to outwit the Russians, because it's the only way that they can compensate for the much larger numbers of tanks that Russia has. So it's got several hundred tanks that would have been they would have to fight this summer that are gone because it destroyed them over the winter. So that explains that. So I hope you can see from all this, Russia's got no chance of advancing in Ukraine. It's got absolutely no chance of advancing against NATO, because remember that Ukraine is not using the best NATO equipment. So start looking at how vastly superior the NATO equipment is. So the Russian S-400, it couldn't stop the HIMARS missiles, which are 1980s technology. And this was ultra-modern, and Russia sold them to Turkey, and they were telling the world how brilliant its S-400 were. When it came to actual battle, they were rubbish. They couldn't stop the HIMARS missiles. And then Ukraine hasn't managed to destroy any of the Patriot mission systems, or indeed any of the Ukrainian air defense systems, any of the substantial ones. Whereas in September 2023, Ukraine destroyed units of an S-300 and S-400 in Crimea. They destroyed S-300s before, and that was the first S-400, I think. And then it started doing it in Luhansk. And it's been destroyed quite a few, I don't know how many, but it's destroyed several of the most advanced S-400 air defense systems that Ukraine has. And so they're not very good. They're just not very good. And that's the update about when they shot down, and then Ukraine's Patriot air system, they shot down the hypersonic, maneuverable, superfast, and which missiles that Putin had claimed couldn't be stopped, and Patriot stops all of them. So this is a pattern that we get, that Russia will boast that it has a missile system that NATO can't stop, and then NATO stops them all. NATO doesn't say anything about HIMARS. It just says, look, here we're giving you HIMARS missiles, and Russia, and then it just goes straight through the best of the Russian air defenses. So NATO understates and Russia overstates what their equipment is able to do, and that's consistently all the way through the war. It's been all with everything. Now we go to the fighter jets, and the NATO fighter jets are vastly superior. So Russia's 4.5 generation, you might think, what's the difference between Russian 4.5 and Russian 5? It's immense. 5th generation fighter jets are built from the ground up, so they're just tiny little spots, just like a potato or something. An entire fighter jet would have the radar cross section of a potato or something. It's almost invisible. And if I'm not quite sure how high, but not a very big thing. It's very, very difficult to spot on radar. And I don't know physically the actual size. I saw numbers. I saw an analogy. It wasn't a potato. It was something else. I can't remember what it was. But something very small. So the F-35 is so radar invisible that when the F-35 pilots had to bail out of an F-35 fighter jet over the United States, and the United States had to send out an alert and it didn't have a transponder on, and so that means the US air defense system couldn't spot their own F-35 fighter jet, and they sent out an alert to their civilians saying, look out for a crashing plane because we don't know where it crashed. So the F-35 is very, very hard, even for modern, very good air defences, to spot. And Russia doesn't have anything like that. Russia tried to develop an F-35. It's got the know-how to make an F-35. It doesn't have the finance. And the Su-57, which is the Russian equivalent of the F-35, is still a prototype, and they just can't find enough funding to make it. It flies around sometimes, but it's nowhere near combat ready. And it's not going to be combat ready anytime soon, maybe never. And they have the problem with the oligarchs. They have the problem they have a much smaller GDP, much smaller economy than the United States. They simply can't afford to develop an F-35, a 5th generation fighter jet. And the 5th generation fighter jets, they are able to, the 5th generation fighter jet by themselves can, I think I talked about the command posts and how Russia's, the rather ancient fighter jets that depend on command posts to direct their operations. Every F-35 is its own command post. It doesn't need any command post to tell it what to do, or to help it to find targets, to help it how to target them, to help it to fire its missiles or anything. It does everything itself. An F-35 can just fly over. It can see an air defense system on the ground is pointing up towards it. It can fire an anti-air defense system back and hit it and destroy it, even before the air defense system on the ground can see it. Indeed, well out of range. The air defense system on the ground is trying to see an F-35. It can't see it because it's too small. The F-35 sees it, sending out radar. It'll then fire back and it'll destroy it. It does all of that by itself, without any help from any air command system, just by itself. So an F-35 fighter jet said that it's like an invisible team. This is from Billy Flynn, an F-35 test pilot interviewed by Aviation Today. I think it was April 2023, I'm not sure. He said, or was it 2022 or 2023, I can't remember. He said that the F-35 would see all the air-to-air threats and kill them all. It would completely neutralize the surface-to-air missile threats too. So I said in a parallel world, which NATO does not want to be dragged into, the F-35 would completely destroy the Russian forces. He said it's like playing football, and you'd be thinking about American football, which is why I used the American football photograph. And imagine if your team was completely invisible. Then you would have quite an advantage in a game of American football, wouldn't you? All they would be able to see is the ball. They wouldn't be able to see the players. And the players can see each other, but the other team can't see them. That's what the F-35s are like. And so, and then Russia has not only got old planes, it's not only got only Russian 4.5 fighter jets, and Ukraine used its very ancient MiG-29s, and because the Russian pilots are just not trained to fight. So Russia is very used to using its fighter jets against countries that don't have fighter jets. And it's very good at that. It hasn't got a clue at fighting with its fighter jets against a country that's got fighter jets that are with pilots that are just as skilled as its own. And it turned out in this war that the Ukrainian pilots are far better pilots than the Russian pilots. The Russian pilots, they're very top down. They will only do what the general tells them to do. And I've got this quote from Professor Philip O'Brien, and he said that it was expected to plunge deep into Ukraine, seize Ukraine and destroy the Ukrainian military by getting complete air control over Ukraine. But they never managed that. Indeed, they were able to fly over much of Ukraine in the first few days. Very quickly, the Ukrainians got together their MiG-29s. They flew around, they flew them off roads, they built hundreds of improvised runways all over Ukraine, and soon the MiG-29s were fighting back, and they drove Ukraine out of Ukraine into just the areas that they'd occupied. So ever since then, the Russians have only been able to fly over occupied Ukraine. Over the rest of Ukraine, their fighter jets are destroyed. And this was before Ukraine got its advanced air defense systems. Now it has Patriot. The Russian fighter jets have no chance. They can't even fly near the front line. Patriot shoots, as I said, shoots down the Russian fighter jets far from the front line. So, so Russia is just turned out to be very rubbish at fighting in the air. It just never trained in it. And it turned out that the Russian fighter jets had no initiative. So a Russian fighter jet would fly over. Ukraine discovered it can just drive in convoys to the front line, and a Russian fighter jet will fly over the convoy and go and drop a shell on some city because that was what it was told to do. And it'll just ignore things. It ignores targets of opportunity. The Russian fighter jet pilots are not given permission to divert from their mission to deal with dynamic changing situations. And so Russia is just hopeless in the air. It's just not very good in the air. And so now what have we got here? Right. So then, and then Russia can't win a war with nukes. So this is just very quickly, I've talked about this many times. So if, first of all, of course, NATO would still have a nuclear deterrent. There's no way that Russia could destroy all the NATO nukes with its nukes. The Soviet Union never had the capability, nor did Russia at any point. It certainly doesn't have that capability. And then suppose instead of trying to destroy the NATO, and then it can't destroy all the nuclear subs at all. So now, suppose instead of trying to destroy NATO's nuclear deterrence, nuclear capability, Russia was to try to destroy its conventional capability. It doesn't have enough nukes for one nuke for every US and UK airbase. Not airbase, military base, sorry. Couldn't change air to military there. Never mind the destroyers, the fighter jets, and then all the other countries in NATO. And one nuke wouldn't be enough to completely devastate a military base anyway, which of course would be hardened against nukes. So you can see from that there's no way that Russia, with its nukes, could win a war. If it just said, okay, we took that, even if Russia was totally ruthless, it didn't care who it killed in NATO. And of course, there are people for instance, many of the oligarchs still have relatives in European countries and so on. But suppose they just didn't care at all, they still wouldn't be able to win. They simply couldn't win. They just lose. And then NATO has this vastly superior equipment. It would soon take over the Russian airspace. That's the end of probably the end of Russia. The rest of the world would say, we can't let Russia have nukes anymore. They wouldn't be able to take over Russia on the ground. That's much harder, as we saw in places like Gaza Strip and in Azov Steelworks and so on. But they can certainly take over Russia from the air and take over the entire Russian airspace and then prevent them launching things from ICBMs and so on. So now we come down to, so there's no way that Russia is going to do a first strike using nukes. So now we go down to why do very few people actually say all this, what I'm saying. So I've hunted around, I can't find people saying what I'm saying. And so what I've told you, I've shown you all, you can check every detail that I've said is correct. It's hard to find anyone who gives the overall picture like I'm doing. Most we have are very vague things, and I'm doing this. I'm obviously not doing this for any military reason, for any political reason. I would rather nobody even listen to any of this, who has anything to do with the military planning or anything like that. It's nothing to do with that. I don't want. It's not for politicians. It's not for military people. All this is just for scared people. And I'm just telling you very obvious things that any military experts would be able to tell you are correct. And just put together in a picture that is rather different from the picture that you get from all these people using lots and lots of spin, and they're trying to persuade people to do things. They're trying to intimidate Russia. They're trying to get the people in the House in US Congress to pass a bill. They're trying to get NATO countries to step up on making artillery and making other things. They're trying to persuade Russia that it is in a strong position in order to encourage it to attack instead of defend, because it doesn't want Russia to defend itself. They've got all sorts of different activist reasons for encouraging Russia, and Russia on its side wants to present itself as winning to its own people. They all reinforce each other, but it's all spin. And as I told you at the beginning of this video, how to detect spin. So I'm reading these articles, the same ones you do. I can detect spin. I know intellectually. It's very similar to knowing how to read an academic paper. You know what to check out for. You have things to check out for. If you go and read an academic paper, and the academic paper only mentions things on one side of a debate and not on the other side of a debate, then you know it's not a good paper. It's just the same way that I'm assessing this. I'm not because of any knowledge of anything to do with knowledge of military, but just knowledge of how you do academic rigor. And I can easily tell, it's very obvious, the Institute of Study of War is not being academically rigorous when it says some of the things it says, when it's doing this very obvious spin, only presents one side. It is clear spin, and they themselves would know, they would have to know that they're doing spin if they're academic. They are academics, and they would be able to distinguish in their mind, okay, in this article I'm being academically rigorous, in this article I'm doing spin. They have to know they're doing spin. So the only question is why. So it's good to look at some people who but what happens is that there's some people say, oh, this is going too far. And the particular ones I've heard is Admiral Radakin has said this several times. So he does not like it when the military starts scaring people in the United Kingdom. So he's one of the few generals who steps up and says, don't scare our people. This is not right. We are not on cusp of war with Russia. We're not about to be invaded. Let me scop some of the most sensationalist headlines of late. So Admiral Radakin, he has said things like this several times. He keeps saying that we are not at risk of war. Russia is not going to be daft enough to attack NATO. So he's one of the few people who says that. And then here's someone else. This is Josep Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat, and he has said that war is not imminent. We live in peace, we support Ukraine, we're not part of this war. And he says, don't frighten people unnecessarily. War is not imminent. What is imminent is the need to support for Ukraine. So there are a few cool heads there. And then Admiral Radakin explains the biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a war conflict with NATO because Russia will lose and lose quickly. And then he talks about, like I explained about Bakhmut, that was an area of 40 square miles. Avdiivka is about 29 square kilometers. That's actually less than 5 by 5 square miles. And it took 5 months, he says, and 17,000 Russian lives and over 30,000 injured in order to take 29 square kilometers. That's from UK intelligence. And Bakhmut was a little bit bigger and it took 9 months of fighting. There's no way that that is a realistic threat for, Berlin or something. Bakhmut is a tiny city. The Avdiivka is by the side of Bognor Regis. It's a little coastal resort on the coasts of the United Kingdom. It's a tiny, tiny place. 30,000 or so. So why doesn't NATO say all this? Well, as I say, there's several reasons. I've given more than 4 reasons. I've got something like... Anyway, Ukraine wants Russia to be overconfident attacking in Donbass. I think the last thing Ukraine wants is for Russia to go on defensive. Then it doesn't want to overpromise. So it overpromised in 2023 because the minefields were... Yeah, I've only got 2 things there. I said 4, but I only gave 2. So they're far wider than expected and far more densely packed and all that. And so, I think I explained that already. And then this is, did I explain this? Maybe just a little bit, so just explain a little bit better. This is how Russia, so the 3 places, this is not giving away anything. So there are lots of possibly secret, the other things that people suggest that are less often mentioned, and I won't mention those. But they're not secret, but they're just not mentioned very often. But the ones that are frequently mentioned are that they're going to go through Verbove, and they would then have artillery control over the coast road, and they'd stop the supply to Kherson and to Crimea by coast. And then the other one is advantage here across the Dnieper River, and then that would obviously give them advantage on Kherson Oblast and towards Crimea, and it would give some protection for Kherson City, and it's just a good place to have a. So these are 2, and then there's other people they often discuss up there. You frequently see the military experts discussing whether, especially in 2023, not so much. They don't discuss the counter-offensive so much just now, but then they talked about how if Ukraine was just to go a little bit further there, then it would cut through major supply routes that supply Donetsk, and that's not a place for an obvious counter-offensive, although and where Ukraine has quite a strong position there. So those are the 3 ones, but there are numerous other places. Right, Ukraine luckily has half a dozen or more different possible counter-offensives, and it'll probably decide depending what happens. Right, so that's it. I've finished this video. So I hopefully this will help you realize that. So just a very quick summary of what I said there. So, and just to do a quick summary to finish. So France doesn't need soldiers. France needs equipment. Ukraine doesn't need soldiers. Zelensky doesn't need soldiers. He's never asked for soldiers. He wants equipment. And he says that the French army can stay in French territory. Russia is not advancing anywhere at anything like enough speed to have any significant effect on the rest of Ukraine. It's tiny details you can't even see at this scale of the map. The small advances that Russia achieved over winter 2022-3 and winter 2023-4, both of those made differences you can't actually see at this scale of the map. And yet Russia makes a big fuss about it. And then people claim that this means that Russia is going to take the rest of Ukraine, but you can't even see these changes at this scale. It's obviously, I mean, it's just very bizarre that people actually think that. And actually, Ukraine has got footholds, and it's actually the Russian situation is far weaker going into 2024 than it was going into 2023, because they didn't build any of these defences in as far as nobody's been talking about them this winter like they did in 2023-3, and because they have no longer got the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea, and that's a big difference from last year, and they can no longer fly the command posts over the Azov Sea, so they've got very little support. They've just got the troops on land with very little air support and very little sea support, and they've got big problems with logistics in Ukraine. Anyway, I could go on a long digression about how Ukraine is doing lots and lots of counter-offensive drone strikes in Russia now, which it wasn't doing in early 2023. So it's a very different situation. And then Ukraine will have the F-16s as well. And then we go down and talked about how the Czechia is that the supply problems are being solved now, that Ukraine is Europe is stepping up on its supply of shells, and I talked about this big initiative which is involving where is it? Yeah, 31 projects in Germany, Norway, France, Italy, Greek, Czechia and Finland. They're all stepping up on producing these shells. And then we've got the other shells that Czechia are buying from Pakistan, India and South Korea. And all of that combined is dealing with this shortfall. Then we've got all this extra funding I talked about. And then we talked about how Russia needs shells far more than Ukraine because of the way it attacks and where it has to kind of demolish cities in order to defeat them. And it's destroying the industry as it advances through eastern Ukraine, so it's hardly going to be much of a prize for Russia. It's more like sitting on a sand heap rather than actually capturing a useful industrial area of Ukraine. It won't be useful anymore. And then talk about how Russia's rapid advance in spring 2022 were because Ukraine only had ancient equipment, it's much better equipment now. Ukraine is not short of soldiers, that's a complete misunderstanding. It's only does it's on defensive in winter because it would lose lots of tanks if it were to try to do counter-offensives in winter. So it doesn't do that. Russia does its offensives in winter because Russia has got loads of tanks, but every time it advances in winter it loses several hundred of its not that easy to replace tanks. So it's not that sensible for Russia. It's got big stockpiles, but they're going down. And Russia is certainly not going to invade. And I talked about how the Russian equipment has turned out to be far worse than people thought. The NATO equipment is far better. It can shoot down the Russian fighter jets, the Russian even its most advanced hypersonic missiles, which Putin had said were unstoppable. And then I talk about how the fighter jets are like an invisible team in football. And if your team is invisible, you're certainly going to have a significant advantage on a football team field. Indeed, the other team is probably not going to be able to score any goals. And then and I talked about how Ukraine is not, it hasn't got F-35s, but it can keep Russia out of its airspace with its fewer very ancient MiG-29s. And it's already doing that. So when it gets the F-16s, in the spring of this year, then it's going to be a significant improvement for Ukraine. And NATO probably doesn't quite realise. It thinks these are ancient, almost worth really need for the scrap heap for to sell to other countries that don't have such demands on their air defences that we do. That's how NATO thinks about them, because they've got the F-35s, which are so vastly better. But for Ukraine, the F-16 will give them parity with Russia in the air, but Russia has got far worse pilots than the Ukrainians, and so the Ukrainians may be able to do much more with their F-16s than people credit them to being able to do. And then I gave these examples of dead diplomats and generals that are reinforcing this message, and the very few people who just straightforwardly say this, and Admiral Radakin is one of the very few who just completely says, look, Russia can't attack NATO, and he's just very clear about that. And that is the true situation. But there are very few people who are saying that. So just don't get scared. There's nothing here to be scared with. NATO is downplaying it. Ukraine is going to do counteroffensives. Ukraine is sure to start doing counteroffensives in 2023 if it gets the Ukraine bill from the United States is passed. Then it might do major ones. It might, for instance, liberate all of Kherson Oblast. It's not impossible. It might even do more than that. If not, then it's probably going to do small counteroffensives of some sort. I mentioned 3 possibilities of places where it could just advance, say 10, 20 miles, or could advance 50 miles or 100 miles. And this would be a significant counteroffensive that would give it a big kind of salient looking over the rest of the occupied Ukraine and make it very, very difficult for the Russians. Because the Russians are kind of pressed around the outskirts of Ukraine. And if Ukraine can push out like that, it makes it very hard for the Russians to supply different parts of their front line. They've got 1,000 kilometers from there to there. And Russia and Ukraine can just go drive to there like that. But Russia can only drive to there along like that. So Russia is in a strategically quite poor position. And then the more that Ukraine pushes through from the inside, then the more difficult Russia's position gets, kind of cramped in around the edge of Ukraine. And then if it cuts through the coastal route, then Crimea gets very vulnerable. So, and if Ukraine takes back this area of Ukraine, for instance, the Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts, and a little bit of Donetsk down to Mariupol, if we went all the way back to the original Donetsk region, even more so, the original Donbass region, and just pushed Russia back to that, then Crimea would be extremely vulnerable. And with the equipment that Ukraine has today, Russia wouldn't be able to hold on to Crimea in that situation. And so they'd likely lose Crimea. So at some point, as this happens, it's likely that Putin says, well, enough is enough. I'm not going to be able to come out of this any better. And then he would likely withdraw at that point. And then he'd somehow present that as a win to the Russian people. And that is the perhaps one possible way this war could end. So, anyway, hopefully that helps you, and helps you to be a little bit less scared. And there's absolutely no risk of NATO getting involved directly fighting Russia. There's no possibility, not even the remotest possibility, of Russia attacking NATO. And I hope this helps you all to be a lot less scared about this. And this is the only reason I'm doing this video. It is of no political reason. I'm not trying to promote any political point of view. I'm not trying to promote anything militarily. I'm just giving you a clear view of the situation in Ukraine and what's happening there. And to help you to understand, there's no possibility of, and of course, I can't help having some bias because I live in the UK and so on, but I'm presenting as clear a position as I can of what is going on along the front line, and my best understanding based on what I've seen and what I understand of what I read of what the situation is. And then just to remind you all, just ground yourself in kindness. And just remember, this is a tiny detail of the entire world that we focused on in this video. And just look around, look at the kindness in your life. And so many people are so kind all the time. And just try, that is very good for your mental health and very good for being much more grounded in the world and not caught up in so much in these tiny events which are not going to take up much of, they're not going to affect the rest of the world. It's only a small, remember, most of Ukraine is at peace, almost at peace. There's nobody fighting in this area of Ukraine. They have the Patriot air defense system now, which makes it much safer for the civilians. The people, Kherson is in danger. So Kherson is an area where it's not very safe, and all the way along the front line. If you're very close to the front line, then you'll get Russian shells coming in and things like that. But if you're anywhere else in Ukraine, then it's essentially at peace. There is a risk, but it's far less than a risk of a traffic accident, of a Russian missile. So, and then outside of Ukraine, there isn't a war going on in the rest of Europe. All that's happening is that people are gearing up the industry in order to supply Ukraine, and their soldiers aren't even fighting. Nobody is fighting in Ukraine except volunteer fighters from other countries. None of the other countries are fighting in Ukraine. None of the countries are even likely at any stage to get involved in fighting in the Ukraine war. They're just involved in producing in training Ukrainian soldiers and in the defense industry ramping up in order to produce the equipment that Ukraine needs. And that's all that's happening outside Ukraine. So, anyway, hope this helps.